book, of course, was Peter Wright's memoirs. Peter Wright had been an MI5 agent, and Mrs. Thatcher took the view that no MI5 officer should ever be allowed to reveal anything about their work, whether it was in the public domain, whether it was well known, whether it was innocuous, like, perhaps the contents of the menu in the MI5 canteen. So she was seeking to assert an absolute duty of confidence. Now, the case, however, was a very interesting and complex combination of politics, of espionage. Of course, the Cold War was still in full flight. This is 1986. But also it exposed the extraordinary hypocrisy of the British government and the British establishment, because there was nothing in Peter Wright's book that was in fact new, because it had already been published by Chapman Pincher in a series of books that had been sanctioned, unofficially of course, by the British government itself. And indeed, as we later found out, long after the trial, the involvement in Chapman Pincher in getting this material out had been encouraged, initiated in fact, by none other than Robert Armstrong, Margaret Thatcher's cabinet secretary. And there's a delicious moment in the trial where I put it to Armstrong that he had in fact, or the government had in fact, encouraged Pincher to write these books so that the theory about the head of MI5 having been a Soviet agent could go out through a safely conservative pen. And Armstrong said, "Oh, Mr. Turnbull, that's a very ingenious conspiracy theory, but utterly untrue." But in fact, of course, whether it was ingenious or not, it was utterly true. So, it wasn't just Peter Wright that was on trial. It wasn't just the antiquated idea that, matters relating to MI5 should under all circumstances be forever hushed up. It was the hypocrisy of Whitehall and Number 10 in particular that was put on trial.
And so why was that then? Was it just because it was Peter Wright and because of the job that he had done and the kind of the understanding that the government had at that point that no one in his position should ever reveal this stuff?
Well, I think it's really an example of this sort of hypocrisy or cognitive dissonance, you might say, in the British government thinking at the time, because on one part of their brain, they had actively encouraged Wright's revelations to go out into the public domain. I mean, Lord Victor Rothschild had been the intermediary. He had channeled money to Wright from Pincher. Pincher had been encouraged to get onto this by Armstrong himself and hence by Number 10. When Pincher's book was about to come out, even though the government got obviously pre-warning of it, they took no steps to restrain its publication. So you had all of that happening on one side, and on the other side of the brain, the official brain, was the proposition that information about MI5 should be kept absolutely secret. And so, essentially, it was a case of the official Britain saying to its employees, you cannot do something overtly that we nonetheless reserve the right to do on a covert and deniable basis.
Mm. What was the impact of the decision, of the ruling, do you think?
Well, the first impact was, of course, that Wright was able to publish his book everywhere, and he made a fortune out of it. Of course, it was a book that probably would have sold 50,000 copies if it had been if Thatcher hadn't tried to ban it. So that was the first thing. But I think at a policy level, it really exposed the stupidity of this absolute duty of confidence. I mean, the argument we put to the British government before the trial was take the approach the Americans do. We'll give you the manuscript. You tell us what passages are sensitive, that affect current operations, that will disclose current methods and methodologies. And our point was to say this is really history. And,
Mm.
the Americans of CIA and other agencies got a very well trodden path for approving that kind of thing. And of course that's exactly what happened later. I mean, you've since after Spycatcher, the intelligence agencies, both MI5 and MI6, became much more open to the public. You've had many memoirs written, which have, presumably been blue penciled or vetted, and I think that's much healthier. So I think we struck a blow for democracy and transparency and openness, and that was a good thing.
You said that most of the material, or if not all of the material, was already out there because of the book by Chapman Pincher. If some of the material hadn't been, if some of it had been new, what do you think would have transpired legally?
Well, I mean, they may have been able to then just seek an injunction to restrain the publication of certain passages. But
Mm.
the British government didn't actually make that. They just made the case that there was an absolute duty of confidence. Or really, it wasn't really a duty of confidence because the material Peter was publishing. This book, by the way, was ghostwritten by Paul Greengrass, who went on to become one of Britain's greatest film directors. But
Mm.
their argument really was not so much asserting an absolute duty of confidence, but an absolute duty of silence.
Mm.
And they, I mean, ultimately, there was a lot. Look, it was a fascinating case. I mean, my wife Lucy and I were the legal team, the Australian legal team on the case, and we ended up winning. We ended up winning finally in the High Court of Australia. We won at trial. We won 2-1 in the Court of Appeal, and then we won in our highest court, the High Court of Australia, 7-0. But we won on a rather arcane legal point that Lucy had written, that I might say about public international law, which I might say the trial judge quite sensibly hadn't paid much attention to and had focused on the facts. And any lawyers listening to that will know what I mean. That trial judges should focus on trying the facts and not
Mm.
get too overly concerned with the refined legal arguments.
What was the impact for you then of winning that case and of being so associated with that case in terms of, well, I mean, obviously, you went on to very high office, becoming the Prime Minister of Australia. Did it cause any awkward conversations, anything over the years when it came to anyone within the British establishment at all? Anyone, any other Prime Ministers that you met, Foreign Secretaries, etc., anything at all?
Well, no, not really. No, it always produced a bit of light humour when I was dealing with the British intelligence services, which I did occasionally. And I was Prime Minister. We'd have meetings with Theresa. We had one meeting with Theresa May and the, and the head of GCHQ was there. I think the head of six, MI6 may have been there as well. But look, yes, no, I think it had all become. It was a long time ago. You've got to remember. I mean, I was Prime
Mm.
Minister in nearly 30 years after the Spycatcher case. The Although there was one sort of point, funny but sort of somewhat poignant moment I recalled when I had an audience with the Queen, and obviously don't be careful about what you say about those discussions. But I did observe to her that I'd recently, or she raised with me, she knew that I'd had a meeting with Prime Minister May and the on intelligence matters with the prime ministers of Canada and New Zealand as well, I might add. And I yes, and I said, well, I imagine if I'd had that meeting, 30 years ago, I probably wouldn't have been allowed to leave. She thought that was very she thought that was very amusing. I mean, that was after Her Majesty's death, I was, as so many people did, just reflected on how absolutely au fait of current events and personalities and interested in, political affairs that she was, right up to, into her very, very old age.